Hi, my name is Norm Friesen and I'm here to talk to you today about the problem with learning. When I say that learning has a problem or is a problem, what I'm saying is not that the process of learning is a bad thing or that learning outcomes are a problem. What I am saying is that the term learning in education, both in the way that it informs educational discourse and research, and also practice and ways of thinking in everyday life and everyday practice, are a problem. If there's a motto for this presentation, is one from Ludwig Wittgenstein, who described his activities as a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. So I'm saying that the term learning bewitches the way that we talk about and understand education, and that what we need to do is to battle this. I will try to show this in my presentation. So to begin, it's important to realize the importance of learning in educational discourse. The way that I frame the term is by saying that it is a master signifier. Master signifier is a term that comes from semiotics. It is a term or sign that, despite the fact that it is ultimately empty of meaning, serves as a nodal point for dominating and grounding all the other terms and meanings in the discourse. One way of arguing that learning has this role is by just looking at ERIC, which is a database that collects articles in English and has been sponsored over the last decades by the US Department of Education. It has over 150,000 articles whose titles contain the word learning. This is second only to the term education itself. So you might be wondering, though, how is learning actually empty? Well, learning can be said to be empty because instead of meaning any one thing in particular, it means basically everything. It talks about everything. It's relevant to everything in education. It can be seen as kind of covertly or in a hidden way covering all of the principal aspects of education. So learning is seen as a process, as an act that is central to education. It is also seen as the product of education and of teaching. In other words, once one has been educated, one has learned something, one has attained a learning outcome, one has achieved learning. Learning is also used to discuss the way that this process does occur. For example, according to Piaget's stages in terms of the development of children. It's also used to discuss the way that learning should occur. So when we think about, for example, Dewey's famous statement that learning is the product of activity and is not the product of teaching, what Dewey is saying there is not necessarily, or not so much, that teaching doesn't produce learning or can't produce learning. What he's saying is that real learning, or the learning the way it should occur, is something that happens through activity, through the activity of the student. Learning even goes further than this, though, in terms of the way it's used in the discourse. It implies teaching, instruction, and design. So it implies its logical counterpoint, which is teaching versus learning. And it implies also that that instruction and design are the cause of learning. So when we talk about implementing learning, implementing project-based learning in the classroom, or we talk about learning design as a field, both of those place the term learning in the position of instruction. Because what we're doing is we're implementing project-based sort of instruction and support in the classroom instead of learning, because we can't do that directly. And we're not designing learning, we're designing instruction. Now I'm going to show how this problem is much more widespread than these examples by focusing specifically on constructivism and networked learning. I'm going to start off by looking at how learning is defined by educational psychology and in relation with discourses of technology in education. Then I'm going to talk about how it appears from the perspective of lived experience of the student. And one way that it appears from the student's perspective is it is individual, impenetrable, and invisible. And if you're wondering about whether learning is indeed so elusive, just think about the fact that there's no way of really establishing what's happening in a classroom in terms of learning other than by tests, through testing and examination, through the students creating an external product that somehow signifies something that has happened internally. I'm going to talk about how learning from the lived experience of the student is something that it involves dispositions, practices, and habits, and ones that are related to receptivity, openness, and passivity, even to shared emotions. I'm going to talk then about the relationship of teaching and learning, and finally break down the results of our bewitchment by the term learning. So, psychology offers definitions of learning that are about activity, that are about meaning making, that are about knowledge construction, and active and deep processing. Network learning, for example, defines learning that it sees as valuable as taking the form of processes of collaborative, cooperative, and collective inquiry, of knowledge creation and knowledgeable action. All of this is underpinned by trusting relationships, motivated by a sense of shared challenge, and enabled by technologies. So learning and technologies are related to each other because learning is a process, it's an explicit activity, and technologies can help us do this in a way that's more efficient, more effective, can help us communicate, can help us collaborate, can help us cooperate. But what psychology does by focusing exclusively on activity and on and its products is to reduce learning to the act of learning, to the fact that learning is some sort of active process that we engage in the same way that we engage in walking or running or throwing a ball. So what this quote is saying is that psychology defines learning in terms of explicit activity and in terms of the goal that that explicit activity is meant to reach, meant to attain. Here's another way of putting this. Learning is familiar to us primarily from its achievements, from its results. This goal-oriented understanding of learning allows the structure of its progression, the course of learning as experience, to recede behind the final product. The majority of learning theories are teleologically oriented in this way. They are ordered as a series of steps that whose value and purpose is understood in terms of the attainment of the outcome. So the majority of learning theories are teleological, goal-oriented exclusively in this way, and the goal is what is objectively fixed, which is then made as the standard of learning. So let's look at everyday language, though, and think about our experiences of learning. When we talk about understanding and learning every day, we often use expressions that aren't about us being active and going out and getting something. Instead, we say things like, the other shoe dropped, the penny dropped, it occurred to me, it dawned on me, hit or struck me. And what these common expressions indicate is that learning is not always a question of what we do and us going out to get something. Instead, learning is something that occurs to us, that we undergo. It's an experience in which we are not entirely active, rather in which we have to be open and receptive and even passive. In this context, learning is not defined in terms of its outcomes, but as it is experienced, determined in terms of where you start off from, what its beginning is, rather than its future or its ultimate outcome. Pranga, who I quoted earlier, even compares learning to something like eating. He says, primarily, we are not acting when we eat. In other words, he's thinking of the fact that things are prepared for us, are placed in front of us, or that we do it ourselves before we actually eat. Eating is something that we experience, that we endure, and that we receive. When we learn, we are primarily receptive, not active, and only secondarily active by choosing or refusing to eat or to learn, or receiving what is given to us to eat with pleasure or displeasure. There's a new view or a different view of learning that's emerging, in which learning is not about us going and constructing our own knowledge, but rather about being open to something that is new, different, unknown, unfamiliar. And surely that must be one of the basic understandings of what learning is about, rather than us already engaging in something that we know and reaching a goal that we already have determined. It is us waiting and being led somewhere to an ultimate outcome that we as students are not fully aware of. In thinking about learner-centered learning and the way that curricula and learning paths are typically designed and understood, they're understood and defined from this kind of bird's eye view, from a third-person view. And you can see that a number of stages are laid out here. These stages basically refer to beginning with simple shapes and figures, comparing them in very basic terms, and going all the way to carrying out calculations having to do with the perimeter and the area of these shapes and forms. Now, this is how we understand learning typically in education. But when we take the perspective of the learner or the student, we don't know about area and measuring the perimeter of a shape and even labeling necessarily all of the shapes. Instead, we are confronted with this idea that we need to describe the length, including long, longer, longest, short, shorter, shortest, etc. That's what we're grappling with or engaged in. And from this first person's perspective, learning again is an encounter with something that we didn't necessarily know about. Certainly, it can build on previous experiences, but in a lot of cases, those experiences are not structured and not organized in a way that has to do with academic learning. Experience then is at the place where learning starts, and it's not the progression or the end of learning. So very different understanding of learning and use of the term. There's another aspect to learning which is really important to understand, and this has been described by a philosopher named Israel Scheffler. Scheffler published a book in 1960 called The Language of Education, and in it he used a very interesting phrase, which is important in this presentation. He characterized teaching as involving the cooperation of the universe. In talking about education, he focuses mostly on teaching and on educating in general, rather than on learning. And what he says, though, applies to learning. He says teaching, whether success is attained in this activity, depends on factors outside of one's trying. The universe must cooperate. So what he's saying is that something unknown, unspecifiable, uncontrolled is involved in learning and is involved in teaching, which he's understanding here as succeeding when it results in learning. So learning, in other words, is not constituted by teaching, and it's not controlled from the outside. There is no cause and effect relationship between learning and the outside world. Instead, learning is an expression of the student or the learner's freedom and responsibility. And it is that way because as a learner, as a student, you have to first want and choose to learn. And even wanting and choosing to learn is still not enough to ensure that learning happens. So for example, if I were to say, well, I want to learn in the next 15 minutes, the basic calculations involved in string theory in physics, I couldn't do it no matter how much I wanted and chose to actually do it, and how much it is an exercise of my freedom to want that. So in other words, to begin to learn something, to choose to learn, is not necessarily to succeed or to end up in learning it. So learning is not a process in the sense that it leads from starting point A of knowing about the length of shapes and then to the calculations of their perimeters and areas, but rather it has an uncertain beginning by necessity. So we've talked about then encouraging the universe to cooperate as being a key element in learning. What does that mean for us as pedagogues? Well, first of all, it means that we need to offer students freedom and enable them to take up responsibility for learning, but at the same time acknowledge that that's sort of the extent of their control. Then learning kind of happens to them if they're lucky. We also need to be able to be willing to take students' first-person perspective on learning, to understand what kind of chance experiences they might have had with what is being taught, and to see that on that basis and being confronted with the lesson that they're currently learning, they are not able to see where it ends up. They are not able to even see some of the next steps in learning. It's important also to realize that one can offer them a third-person perspective of learning, but this perspective is limited in their view precisely because they are learners. We also need to understand the risky nature of learning and the need for letting things occur to students. Learning can't just be about activity, and I'll be talking about, as a result, what learning actually becomes is the process of recognizing and cultivating dispositions, practices, and habits that encourage students to be open, that encourage them to allow learning to occur to them, that create a feeling that they might share or that they might perceive or enjoy, that is one of trust, and that in giving up control of what they're going to do, they actually are going to be treated with respect. They can then be addressed and engrossed in the material and the topics that they're learning. So, going back to the beginning of the presentation, how does learning bewitch intelligence? How does its use in the discourse of education result in errors in thinking and ways of understanding teaching and learning that are not accurate or helpful. Well, let's look at the way learning is actually used in education. We use a term like authentic learning, which is an illustration of the kind of confusion that learning can produce in terms of whether we're talking about learning as it should occur or learning as it does occur. Authentic learning, of course, is the kind of learning that we should have in our classrooms, we're told, or in our... There's a number of article titles that use the word learning in ways that I think really show how mixed up we can get about what's going on. There's one called Implementing Social Emotional Learning in the Classroom. Well, if social emotional learning is actually consists of becoming sensitized to one's own emotions and to others around us, then we don't implement this learning. Rather, we are implementing instruction or a curriculum or ways of engaging with students or having students engage with one another that do aim at this learning at the very most. Teachers' perceptions of active learning, implementation. Again, this is, we're talking about instruction and the design of a certain type of pedagogical strategy. Methods for developing constructivist learning on the web. I love this one. This one is kind of older, but what it does is it makes clear that learning is used essentially in place of instruction and teaching. So because you cannot develop constructivist learning on the web, you can only develop constructivist forms of instruction or forms of learning facilitation on the web. So what these things suggest and how they bewitch our intelligence is by leading us to believe that learning is a stable product, that it is the same thing as teaching, and that also it's always successful because you're developing constructivist learning on the web. You're implementing active learning in your course. Your learning that's going on is authentic, occurring. So, to summarize on a bit of a higher level, learning bewitches intelligence by implying that teaching, design, and instruction are the cause of learning, and it only implies this, but still it does so powerfully. By distracting us from the question of student freedom and responsibilities as prerequisites to any kind of meaningful learning. The term learning distracts us from teaching as the cultivation of habits and receptivity, rather than some sort of active acquisition of something out there in the world. It bewitches us by telling us that because something is one way, that means that it also should be that way. So it confuses normative and descriptive statements and characterizations, and the two are very different and are confused all the time in educational discourse. It bewitches us by leading us to focus on pursuing learning as an end product and seeing learning as a known, planned out and active process for getting to a predetermined outcome. And it tells us that teaching and study in education, because they always are about learning and are about learning both as a process and a product, can only be successful. There's a number of types of learning and ways of thinking about education that I think have been excluded by this emphasis on learning. One of these is actually a type of learning, which is mimetic learning, the kind of learning that happens when young children are growing up, are acquiring language, and are learning to walk and engage and talk and engage with people around them. This is perhaps the ultimate form of learning in a way, but it isn't really accounted for all that well in terms of theories of learning and theories of learning that have to do with instruction. They involve engagement of practicing and imitation, rather than going out there and constructing something anew in the world. It doesn't present a process that would necessarily benefit from better and ever more efficient technology, for example. So practicing and exercises are defined by the fact that they're supposed to be difficult. So there's also the whole emotional and dispositional aspect of learning. Constructivism and cognitivism and behaviorism, none of these main learning theories have a particularly compelling account of affect, of habit, or disposition for learning. Of course, we always talk about motivation, right, which is like a sort of an engine that drives us to do certain things. But the thing is that, as I've been describing, learning as a process that we undergo rather than one that we control and steer and drive to a predetermined outcome involves being open, involves taking risks, involves encountering something that we have no idea what it is and where it will lead us. So what's important is then to have a positive climate or atmosphere. Another thing that is remarkable in some ways is that because learning theory is essentially ahistorical, it's understood as being common across cultures and societies, it's very difficult to connect these theories of learning with what education actually is in the world. So another way of saying this would be to say that the culture or history of education has little or no relationship to the learning process that we know, that we are able to establish. So particularly in educational technology, people have complained about the fact that, well, why are we still confronted with this industrial age or this cottage industry type of school organization in a world where that has moved far beyond it to a post-industrial era? What is the relationship then of the lecture hall, the classroom, the class, the grade, even the school to learning as a natural and kind of cross-cultural process? Very difficult to do, and educational discourse has not really been able to do that. Another result I think that we need to counteract is the belief that because science and psychology can tell us things about the way the process of learning is, and I'm not denying the fact that they can do this, that means that they can also tell us the way that education should be. So a good example here would be neuroscience, which explains certain things about how the brains of young people, for example, are constituted. So then the question becomes, well, okay, do you teach to the way that a student currently is, or do you teach to the way that you want them to be? And that's an educational pedagogical issue and decision. That is not a decision for science to make by its very nature. So my sources in this presentation are all German, but you can check out translations of the phrases and some of the ideas that I've presented here from the paper that I'm essentially presenting. So that the URL is available both in on the video and below in the comments. Thanks very much for your attention.